Welcome to this week's LinkedIn live session, the check-in with the doctor, as I like to say. And this week it actually is a check-in with the doctor because I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Brian Glibkowski. And it took me a while to get that name right, but I finally got it right. Dr. Brian, sir, how are you doing today?
Doing well, Chris. Thanks for having me. Excited about this opportunity.
Well, I'm delighted to have you. I think very highly of your work, and I'm excited to share your work with my network and our listeners. Incidentally, if we do have anybody on live, if you care to say hello, please do. And of course, if you're catching this after the fact, I appreciate you spending a few minutes with us. So Brian, in the unlikely event that anybody in my network doesn't actually know who you are, do you mind just taking a moment and introducing yourself, sir?
Sure. My name is Brian Glibkowski. I am a college professor. I'm also an author. We're going to be talking about my book, Answer Intelligence. And in terms of research, I focus my research on questions and answers and in conversations. So that's me in a nutshell.
It is such an interesting life study. And by the way, we have to say hello. Michael Ashman is with us. Hey, Michael, it's good to see you. It's amazing to me that your life study is questions and answers, and that's an amazing thing. Incidentally, just out of curiosity, you're a college professor. What do you teach? What do you actually teach? I mean, I could guess, but I don't want to. I'll make the first rule of not making assumptions.
Sure. I teach organizational behavior and HR, but I've done a lot of my research in the sales field. Not surprisingly, I think the sales field likes to get stuff done. They like to utilize research and technology. So I'm no stranger to the sales world.
I love it. Now you sort of teased already, this idea of answer intelligence. And I know that you're working. In fact, the book will be published here soon, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Do you mind? Oh, and incidentally, I have to do a shout out to Bernard. Bernard Fisher is a CEO that I've actually worked for about a decade. So Bernard, it's great to see you. So do you mind just taking a minute and introducing this idea of answer of answer intelligence?
Sure, I'll give you the setup. So I started doing research on questions. And all over questions are familiar. Going back to kindergarten, we're familiar with the 6 WH questions. We learn those. In sales, there's question methodologies, and we just take it for granted. So I was really interested on the flip side in terms of answers. And here's a little thought experiment. If I was going to ask you how many question types are there, you would say, 6, or open and close, 2. But if I was to ask you how many answer types are there, you couldn't answer that. And you could Google that right now outside of my work. There really hasn't been a lot of focus on the answer side of the equation. So I set out to do some research with some colleagues, and we decided to study the top golf instructors in the world as rated by Golf Digest and Golf Magazine. And you may say to yourself, why golf instructors? And there were 2 reasons. One, they're experts. We're studying those in the upper half of the 99th percentile. So whenever you study experts, that's a good thing. Second, golf instructors at the highest level teach a wide range of clients. Everything from touring pros you see on TV to weekend warriors to your young daughter picking up the sticks for the first time. So that's important because what we could learn from these golf instructors about how they provided answers had a high likelihood of generalizing to other contexts. If you think of sales, for example, if you're a seller, there's asymmetries of knowledge, right? You're selling to someone that has less knowledge than you, sometimes more in certain respects. Asymmetries of interest. As a seller, you're often very excited about your product and solution. The buyer, maybe a little bit less so sometimes. So it was a great context. And when we did this research, we came up with the AQ framework. Maybe you could bring it up for me, Chris.
I would be delighted to, Brian.
So we developed this framework, starting with the golf instructors, that we've generalized to other contexts. They include 6 answer types: theory, story, metaphor, concept, procedure, and action. And these are familiar, but we've organized it in a framework that maps certain question types, like the why question, to theory and story, what, concept and metaphor, how to, procedure and action. And all 6 of those answers exist within the context, when and where. So as you're telling a story, context matters. In a sales context, if you're sharing a case study and you're selling to a bank, the case study better be about a bank, right? Context matters. A pharma company better be about pharma. And the final question, who, is who needs to ask and who needs to answer the questions. And this is an important point. And the last thing I'll say before I hand it back to you to take us on this conversation is, you may be asking yourself, why do I need this framework? I give a metaphor. AQ has a framework that includes metaphors, but here's a metaphor. AQ is like a target. If you think of a target, if you're not aiming at a target, are you going to hit the target? No. Are you going to hit the bullseye? No. So for the first time, you have 6 answers that are target to aim at during your conversations as you're trying to provide answers to your clients. So, and on top of that, there's 5 high AQ practices, which we can talk about, that we learned from the golf instructors about how they provide answers and what it means for any sales organization.
I love it. So allow me, and incidentally, one of my previous guests, Greg Holmes, he chimed in with the 2 answer types. It's good. It's good to see you, Greg. I love that. So let me, and I'll bring just the 2 of us back for a moment. So you just sort of asked a rhetorical question, why the AQ framework? So let me turn it back on you and have you use your framework to give us. So you gave us sort of the theory of the AQ target, but if I were following, or if we were following your framework, the other part of the why would be answered with a story, correct?
Correct.
So what's an example of a story that you might share to answer the question, why answer intelligence?
Yeah, I'm a coach, not a player. So I always say, others can communicate better than I can, but I like to use AQ, and I'm a student of it, and I like to practice it. So let me give you a story about why I knew AQ was important. So it was when I was first experimenting with this framework. I had a meeting with the CEO, and during our conversation, I wanted to use a metaphor. I knew it was important. The setup was basically, there was a deal opportunity, and it was me, it was a third-party consultant, and then the CEO. So I went in to talk to the CEO, and I simply said, this opportunity is like a 3-legged stool. If all 3 of us don't work together, the stool is going to fall down. Mm-hmm. And I sort of bit my tongue a little bit, and I was saying, this sounds a little cheesy. Is this, going to work? I wasn't really sure. And I wasn't sure that it worked until a week later. I went back to see the CEO, and he used the same metaphor back at me. So he got it. And then I thought a little bit more of, if you bring up the AQ framework again, and I said, why did this answer work? Why did this metaphor work? And the reason it worked is I thought about it some more is because I provided all the other answers, and to be humble, I provided all the other answers that were high quality. I had procedures and actions about how we were going to do things. These were tied to important business concepts he cared about. It was a theory about, business strategy. This was related to other stories I had told him. And so that was related to what became high AQ practice 3, provide complementary answers. When you provide an answer that complements another answer, it reinforces the answer. So, what I've done here is sort of meta. I've given you a story about metaphors, but I'm explaining how the framework works. And let me give you one example about complementary answers. Imagine you're selling to a client, and the client provides you a story about what their problem is. So you can simply acknowledge that answer and say, oh, I get it. And then that's nice. But it's really powerful if you can provide a complementary answer. Imagine if they provide a story and you provide a metaphor that's consistent with the story. Then the person you're selling to, the buyer, has a strong sense, the seller gets me. And it's also a way to triangulate to make sure you understood the story properly. So, using complementary answers is a very powerful technique when you're communicating to someone else.
I so love that. And incidentally, Brian, let me just pause and welcome anybody who may have joined us. And if anybody does have any questions for Dr. Brian, as I'll call him for the moment, I welcome you to ask them. I'm actually going to leave the framework up for a minute because I do think it's worth talking about it. So I completely understand this concept of complementary answers. And if I can sort of repeat it back to you to make sure that I understand, in essence, what you're saying is if somebody asks a how question, then I might explain by sharing a procedure, but then I might follow that with sort of backing that up by the concept that supports or enables that procedure. Or I might go over to an action, right, to say, so because it works this way, let me share with you what you will be able to do as a result. Am I interpreting that concept correctly?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Because at some level, all the questions are interrelated. They reinforce each other. And I'll sort of paraphrase back what you're saying with some different examples, but you nailed it. So if you're selling and your concept is reliability, right? You have software that's very reliable, then you're going to talk about how your procedures or your software product and the algorithms, how those implement reliability. So all procedures are the servant of the concepts, their masters. When we implement something, it's to achieve some end, it's some concept. So you have to go back to the concept, because sometimes if we're talking about, say, features and functions for a software product, you got to bring it back up to the concept so the buyer understands for what purpose, the concept, why we're doing it. And then procedures and actions are interrelated. There are two different ways of answering the how question. And the great way I like to explain this is think of baking a cake. The recipe emphasizes the steps, right? The 10 steps in a recipe. Any given step refers to the action, cracking an egg. So what you have is procedures and actions are related but distinct. And this is important from a selling standpoint. You want to think about both procedures and actions. It's not just actions. It's not just, finding, a unique action or a best practice action. You have to think about the process. It's not just process. We have to get stuff done with actions. So both are important.
And if I may, I know a little bit about the framework. In fact, I think you have sort of an assessment as to how well we, sort of at least understand the framework and use the framework. And I think I tested okay, but it's because I studied your model a little bit. The left side and the right side of the framework is very significant. Do you mind sharing the two different sides of the framework? Yes.
So the left side, theory, concept, and procedure, is logical. These are logical answers. The right side, story, metaphor, and action, are subjective. And this is important because one of the high EQ practices is high EQ practice to answer twice. Each of the questions, why, what, and how, can be answered twice for maximum impact to appeal to both sides of the brain. So, for example, if I was on a job interview and leadership is something I talked about a lot, in some form, you might be asking me, Chris, well, what is leadership? Because, terms are thrown around, they're vacuous. Imagine how powerful it would be if I said, I believe leadership is holding people accountable and inspiring them to be their better selves. And let me explain that in terms of a metaphor. It's like a braided rope. Each is strong separately, but when they're woven together, they're stronger together. That's how I lead. I hold people accountable. I inspire them. I do that on a daily basis. And that's why you want to hire me. Of course, I'm winding it up a little bit here to sort of give you the context for this answer. But I worked with a sophisticated Global 50 consulting firm, a consulting firm that worked with the Global 50 on sort of these complex HR solutions. And they were using Answer Twice because their concept and their product was very difficult to understand. And their buyers were having difficulty understanding the concept, and they could define it and dimensionalize it. But ultimately, when they added the metaphor, they really broke through because metaphors are very relatable. So they started answering twice for some of these key questions. And the last thing I'll say is, answer twice is something to use for impact. You don't want to necessarily use it for every single question because they'll be fatigued, but it's a powerful tool.
So great segue into a question that we got from Greg. His question is, how do we know a good length to an answer? Sometimes it should be, to your point, yes, no. Other times it needs to be backed up. So do you have any guidance specifically on this point?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, first of all, I'll say interesting about the framework is I think we know a lot. We're doing research on it. We're going to learn more. But that being said, we've recognized the importance of versioning of answers. So you want to understand, and I'll get to the yes, no in a second. You want to understand if a client asks you a question, how long can that story be, right? Mm-hmm. If you're doing cold calling, and we could talk about our chapter, Sales IQ, co-author James Kakis and Devin Reed from Pre-Sales Collective and Gong, and look at some of the Gong data, for example, in the top of the funnel, if you ask questions, you lose. In our framework, you have to provide an answer that will stimulate the interest of the buyer, implicit or explicit, that causes them to want to have the next sales conversation. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned that because imagine the story or metaphor you're going to provide in the front end of that sales funnel when you have 15 seconds with a prospective buyer to set up a meeting. It's got to be a very terse story. Other times you have more runway. It's going to be longer. To some extent, the length of the answer is going to be dictated by the interest of the buyer. Length of the answer is going to be dictated by how effective you can respond. All things being equal, you want to be very compact in your answers, and that's always better. It's been said, for example, you think of art, hopefully get back to the Art Institute, Chicago here pretty soon. Those paintings hanging on the wall, they're masterpieces because they're compressed in time and space. So can you give master answers? The last point in terms of yes or no, I think that this can be very effective to go down to a yes or no, particularly if you're on the same page with the client. I don't need to explain a story. They're just looking for a little confirmation. Yes, boom. Then we move the conversation some other way. And the last thing I'll say is sort of variety is the spice of life. When you're providing answers, you want to change the pacing. Sometimes short, sometimes longer. It's more interesting. And you want to give the other party time to talk. If you've been monopolizing the conversation like I have here, maybe I should do some more yes, no answers and give some more time on the other side. So there's a lot of complex factors. But what I will say with the AQ framework, it gives you a framework to think about those answers in a thoughtful way. And last thing I'll say is what we're really introducing with the book is, I think, for the first time, is a real science of answers. There's been a science of questions, but there really hasn't been a science of answers.
I so love that. And as you were talking, the thought that was sort of kicking around my mind is that the best answers may be AQ plus EQ, right? Answer intelligence plus a little bit of emotional intelligence, right? Sort of being able to sort of feel the temperature of the room, right? And sort of sense, is this individual looking for me to truly be the expert right now? Or is this individual trying to demonstrate their expertise, right? Are they trying to show that they're the smartest person in the room, right? So as a salesperson, to me, you need a little bit of both on that. So yeah. The other thought that I had, Brian, and I hadn't thought about this until just now. I'm going to bring the framework back up again. I'm sure you've seen this before. I know I've seen this, and frankly, I've probably done it, a time or two, is that sometimes I'll hear a question or I'll hear an answer being given to a question, and I find myself thinking, you're not answering my question. You're saying words, right? But you're really not addressing. And what it makes me realize is that in that moment, there's actually a mismatch between where I was with my question and where the person. So for example, if I ask a how question, right, and somebody starts giving me some theory, they're avoiding, or if I ask a deeper question like a why, but then they start explaining to me how it works. It's all now. If somebody sort of recognizes that, does that indicate that maybe somebody is trying to avoid the question, in your opinion?
It could be they're trying to avoid it. I know you're asking a why question. I'm more interested in a how answer. I'm going to how, or so they could be avoiding it. I think a lot of it is just ignorance or lack. Not, ignorance is the wrong word. A lack of attention, awareness. That's the word, awareness. So, going back to kindergarten, little children or earlier, they ask the how question, or they ask the how question for everything. When they mean why or when they mean what. And as parents, we interpret that how question to mean all these other types of questions. So that's the start of not understanding what questions are. So this is a framework about answers, but it also helps us unpack what questions are. And so if we're not thoughtful about what questions are, what answers are, we're clumsy. So, so related to this, AQ is a technical framework, not a natural language framework. So we have to take the questions someone asks and we have to interpret them and say, they're saying the words how, but they really mean why. And then once you do that mapping, then you have to say, once a given question is asked, how do I provide an answer? Luckily, there's some tricks you can use. One is if your team or individuals understand AQ, they begin to understand if we ask a why question, we want a theory or a story. And by the way, theory, you can call that strategy if you want to make that more business vernacular. So that's good. The other thing you could do is what we call meta conversations. So if you get asked a question, you can say, would you like me to provide you a story? How about I give you a metaphor to illustrate that? Or let me explain that in terms of a procedure. And they're going to then say yes or no. So you can guide the conversations that way. So there's a lot of things you can do once you start thinking about answers and navigating the conversation accordingly.
Yeah, that's so powerful. And I'm actually going to repeat sort of what you just said and really double down, because this is sort of honestly, this is a learning moment for me, and really it's a reminder that sometimes, particularly in a sales conversation, your customer asks a question, but it's sort of disguised as a how question, but what they're really looking for is more of a why, right? Or if it's disguised, and what I'm hearing is that there's actually no shame, if I can use that word, or potentially harm if done the right way, in saying, you asked how, but are you really asking how, or is it more of a why question? Like, I want to make sure I really understand the heart of your question, right? And then what I'm understanding is that the framework, then once I understand sort of which category of the context of the question, I can leverage either a strategy or a theory to activate the logical side of the brain, or more of a story that will relate to the emotional side of the brain, right? If it's a what question, I can provide a concept or a metaphor. So I just love this. So what you mentioned, there are sort of, am I right? There's sort of 5 sort of rules or best practices that you've built around the framework. Am I right about that?
Yeah, that's correct. And I go through those briefly.
Please.
And again, it's based on the research we did with top golf instructors in the world, and then generalized in other contexts. High IQ practice 1 is provide 6 answers, and in particular, it's providing the best answer. So if you're providing one answer, how can you get it right? Which one do you want to provide? That's so important, and we know that. High IQ practice 2 we've talked about is answer twice, appealing to the left and right side of the brain. High IQ practice 3 is provide complementary answers, adjacent answers. And by the way, the strong form of complementary answers is provide all 6 answers. Okay, so over the course of a job interview, if your number one skill is leadership, you should try to provide all 6 answers, regardless of the questions being asked, and to sort of paint yourself as that expert. In a similar way, I've done some work around, for example, value proposition in a selling context. Can you touch on all 6 aspects of your value proposition in terms of story, theory, concept, procedure, action, and metaphor over the course of an important conversation with a client? Because what you don't want to do with provide complementary answers in the strong form is just be stuck telling stories, right? Stories are great, but imagine what happens if all you do is tell stories. Then after the meeting's over, the buyer goes off their own way and they say, well, they never really talked about how the software worked, or they fill in gaps about how the software worked. And all of a sudden, before you know it, you're losing to a competitor simply because you did not showcase essentially how that story was connected to procedures and actions. You lost. So that's provide complementary answers. High EQ practice 4 is answer with style. So that's where we get the colors here. So the theory and concept yellow, we call that analytical. That's the head. The story and metaphor, the red, is the relational. That's the heart. The procedure and action, the blue, is the practical, right? So that's the hands, so to speak. And the point of the style is each of us has our own style, our preferences of how we like to communicate. And the individuals we communicate with have their own styles. So if you're selling to a buyer that's very relational, you got to pepper in stories and metaphors throughout the conversation. Additionally, understanding your own style will identify weak points. So for example, before AQ, I'm very analytical. I'm yellow first, red second, and blue third. And I used to teach classes without textbooks, without examples. I didn't think anything of it, but I was not being practical in terms of procedures and actions and how to use things. So, understand where you're weak, understand where you're strong. That's habit 4. And finally, high EQ practice 5 is answering context. And we already talked about that. Every single focal answer, those 6 exist within a context, when and where, and you have to understand the local context. The theory about, why buyers buy could be different depending on if it's a small, mid-sized business versus enterprise, a large company, et cetera, and so forth. So that, in a sense, when and where takes you from checkers to chess, or three-dimensional chess, perhaps.
So powerful. I love it. When someone's going into a sales meeting, 2-part question. Do you think we should spend a little more time asking ourselves in advance, are they more likely to be in the why, the what, or the how? And if so, do you have any advice or recommendation on how to do that?
Yeah, I think, let me give you an example. I think it's relevant. It's working with a SaaS organization, the selling organization, and we're doing a workshop. And basically, after the workshop is over, the director came up to me and said, "This is perfect. What big problem we have is that we're selling to senior executives that are focused on the why question. They're interested in theory, strategy, and story, and our sellers don't have a lot of experience. They're focusing on how, features, and functions." So they're asking the why question. They're saying, here's how the product works. I mean, it's totally off, and they're losing. When you talk about like gravitas, have the business gravitas. A lot of times that's connecting to the strategy of the firm or telling stories that are relevant. So the first point is just recognizing you're right. If you don't, I think, profile who you're talking to, and second, you don't listen and hear the actual question, you're gonna lose. I think what you can do is just awareness helps a lot. Awareness that there are different questions. Plan the questions ahead of time. Role play the questions. There are different answers. Plan those out ahead of time. One of the individual on our advisory board, Mike Sonke, who's a retired Dow 30 senior SVP and USA CFO, he shared with me that high EQ practice 1 maybe gets you 50% there, and that's knowing our 6 answers. So what I'd recommend is if you're a selling organization, do some exercises such as thinking through your value proposition and cataloging all 6 answers. And having that ready before you go into calls, your confidence is going to go way up, because you're going to be able to tell a story about your value proposition and then immediately pivot to a procedure or action, or just move around that wheel. I think that's one of the best things I think you could recommend is if you're a sales organization is think about the framework, but prepare your answers ahead of time. Just like when you're practicing in basketball, you're gonna shoot layups and free throws. It's NCAA March Madness right now, and when you do that, you get in the game. You're more comfortable. So just practice using the answers.
I love it. The other thought that came to mind, Brian, is I'll assume, are you familiar with Simon Sinek's I think he calls it the theory of the golden circles, right? People don't buy what you sell, they buy why you sell it. And I think his is why, how, and what is in the middle. Or maybe it's vice versa. I don't remember exactly how he's. So I'm curious, have you ever done any sort of alignment with his golden circles, and are there any lessons? If so, are there any lessons there to share?
Yeah, I haven't explicitly, mapped mine onto his golden circle, but there are some similarities. The why is at the center. The why is, that theoretical, that's important.
Yeah.
My framework is less hierarchical because he has the nested circles.
Right.
What I'm really interested in is saying the why, what, and how questions exist on their own. Some people are very practical. Like you may have an artist that's a virtuoso, or someone that's a great communicator or leader. They just do the how extremely well, but it's difficult for them to say the theory of how they do it. And each of these exist on their own terms. So our framework's a little different. It's actually based on it's a framework based on knowledge. So if you look at the why question, or let me answer the how question is procedural or practical knowledge. We sort of know what that is. The what is related to declarative knowledge, going back to like learning concepts, declarative knowledge, a definition. And then the why is what's called structural knowledge, and that's cause and effect relationships. That's we define it very specifically. And so this may be more of a sort of an academic answer I'm providing here, but I think we have some different assumptions about how these questions are ordered, where I don't prioritize one over the other. They all exist on their own terms. So I'll need to leave it at that, but maybe you have a follow-up. I gave you a quick answer if there's a follow-up.
No, that's good. I mean, here's what I'm hearing, right? Is that the framework is more, it's specifically I guess aimed at helping people identify the question and classifying or categorizing question or answers to the questions appropriately. And so my follow-on question to that is, what advice do you give people to shift this from something that I might have to think about to something that becomes a little bit more natural for people? Does that make sense? Because I know for me, this makes perfect sense. In fact, I love the framework and I love the model. And I told you, I mean, it's something that I might want to include in some of my workshops because I think it's so powerful. But how can people actually develop this more naturally?
Yeah, I think it just gets back to practice, and it gets back to using it. If you start doing workshops, for example, one of our chapters is brand AQ. So sales and brand are related. And it was co-authored by the CEO of Boston Mutual Life Insurance Company, Paul Cronto, and SVP Dave Mitchell at the organization. And basically, we looked at their brand is 6 answers. So we're so focused with branding to think of stories, but they took their brand and they said, here's stories of brand. They had a theory, and their theory was in the insurance industry, a lot of family, right? Well, they went back to the Great Depression. Families that survived the Great Depression had 3 attributes. They're flexible, they're cohesive, they communicated well, and that led to goal achievement. Now, that's a powerful theory. Then you go down to defining each of those concepts, procedures, and actions. If you're a customer service team, how do you implement flexibility? How do you implement cohesiveness and communication? And then they have metaphors about how they explain all this. So it made it very real and rich, and they started using it, and it didn't become awkward. In a similar way, going back to value proposition, take your value proposition and can you articulate it in all 6 forms? Right? If you say your company's concepts are reliability, let's say, can you say, what's your metaphor for that? What's your procedures and actions? So you start to use it and it becomes more familiar. But like anything, it requires practice. But I will say this, it's a relatively light lift to use this framework, because you'll look at it and say, yeah, we all use questions, we all use answers. I'm not making up some exotic framework of, made up words that you have to combine together in some, artificial way. So that's sort of my response.
I really love it. I mean, it's even making me question myself and my business. Can I answer? Do I have an effective answer, right? That falls into theory and falls into story, right? Falls into concept, falls into metaphor, falls into procedure, falls into action. And to your point, and obviously I help people prepare for sales presentations and sales demonstrations. The ability, to your point, the ability to think through the answers to some of the most common questions that we have that fall into each of those categories is unbelievably powerful. So I know you a moment ago, you said you're more of a coach than a player, but how are you using this in your business and in how you operate day to day, week to week?
Yeah, great question. So in my business, I'm basically in the business of AQ, and we have assessments, and we're certifying coaches and going to market, looking for partners. And I'm trying to use AQ when I communicate. So for example, recently I had a partnership discussion, and here's the context. I'm trying to talk to them about partnering with me and developing some software. Okay. And also the context is they have no idea what AQ is. They've never heard of it. The book's not out. They don't know what it is. So that's my challenge. So a specific example is I thought of actions ahead of the meeting and high quality actions I could provide. One of the actions I did, and actually I have an unplanned prompt here, not prompt, but a prop.
Stage prop.
It's about to come out. So anyways, I'm thinking about high quality actions, and slides are part of presentations, right? And I've done presentations with no slides, with too many slides. And I decided I was going to create one slide similar to what you've been showing with the slide of the circle, because that's helpful to share. And I had next to it 3 reasons they should develop software, simple words. And that was a high quality action. I'll explain why in a second. But as I'm going through the discussion, it was really resonating. I wasn't, boring them with some super long deck. We had one slide up via Zoom in the background, just had it up there. We were referencing naturally. And at the end of the call, one of the executives said, wow, I loved your one slide. It really helped us move this along, and we're doing great. And then I, of course, used the opportunity to say, well, I use AQ and I designed this high quality action. And then I reference, many will be familiar with, the Toyota way. So they have an approach, Toyota does, where business proposals have to fit on one page. And these executives knew that. But the point is it always best to use, one slide? No, that's not what I'm getting at. And actually, there's an interesting distinction here. Actions can be many form that might, be proper. Theory and story tend to generalize, and you have like universal stories, universal theories. So those tend to be consistent, but the actions tend to be different. Anyways, in this case, I think I significantly moved myself forward with this partnership, probably skipped an entire meeting because I intentionally used answers as I was navigating the conversation. And this action here was arguably, there's 2 forms of answers that we like to talk about in the book. There's, in terms of high quality, there's best practices. So we're all familiar with those. So you could say what I just did was best practice answer. It could be. The second type of answer is unique. And this is a little bit unusual for people's vernacular. If you're really going to win, you always have to move beyond best practices. And I use the other prop here, not prop, Apple, right? iPhone. When the first iPhone came out, they had the touch interface, right? And that was unique, right? When we're shopping for products, we need something unique. So anyways, it's a long belabored point. When you're providing actions, best practices and unique. And that's something you can do as a sales organization, thinking through those actions and and how can you really tighten that product demo. And there's a lot of things you can do. So anyways, that's an example of how I used it. You will say, though, I'm a coach, not a player. I tend to be a little long-winded, as you may ascertain here, but that's my answer.
No, I love it. Well, and again, I'm going to reference the model. So in that case, you were talking about actions, but then in showing the book, was that a bit of a metaphor? So did you sort of, did you go there? And that's again, that's sort of, to your point, you want to use different sort of categories that are related.
Yeah,
correct?
Exactly. Yeah, that could be moving to metaphor. And the relationship between these 6 answers is fluid. This is a special framework. It's not a circle. It's called circumplex. It means that the answers, the adjacent answers are more related. Opposite answers are least related. So no answer is a pure form.
Yeah.
So what this means is you can transform any given answer to another answer. Like you're saying, is that a metaphor? I think it was. And that's why, by the way, why action and metaphor are related next to each other in the circumplex, because they're very related. There's a theory of metaphors that they're based on actions. They're based on things we see in the real world. So that's why they're next to each other on the circle.
Yeah. No, I so great. I love it. So we're gonna wrap up here in about 10 minutes or so. Incidentally, if we do have folks, and I know we've had quite a few people chime in. If anybody has a question for Brian before we wrap up, I welcome you. And if anybody just wants to say hello, I'm happy to see you as well. Brian, I know we've talked a lot about your model in sales, and you did a shout out to James Kakis. And the other gentleman from Gone,
Devin Reed.
Devin Reed. So I know they've written a chapter on sales. Where else are you seeing your model really resonate with people?
Yeah, I think it really relates to any important conversation. But interviews, I think, is important context to prepare for your interviews. Executive coaching is something we're focused on. Training, does your next training provide 6 answers? Right? If it doesn't, is it really an effective training? In the book, we have several chapters that sort of go to interesting areas. We have a physician AQ chapter, how do doctors communicate? Really interesting because doctors, have very short conversations. Doctor could be in the office for 90 seconds with someone. Those are high stakes. How do you navigate that? We have physician AQ, wealth management AQ, let's see what else is in the, gosh, I gotta look at my own book. Several other branding, I think, is another application. So I think sales, this is great, but also marketing. Those are a couple examples. I
mean, the more I think of it, the more places that I can see this being so useful. I'll bring up the model one last time. To be honest, Brian, it's been such an eye-opener for me. And I just want to personally thank you for the research that you've done and for bringing this to the industry. It's really challenged me on how I answer questions and how I communicate. And it's really forced me to think through and I don't want to be too, sort of meta Q&A here, but what is really being, when somebody asks me a question, which of these categories, like where are they really coming from? What are they really looking for? And my answer needs to map, right, or match what's really being asked. And I need to make sure that I'm balancing both the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. Would you say that that's, at the end of the day, that's really your intent behind the framework as what I just described?
Yeah, I think so. It's here's a metaphor we use in the sales chapter. AQ is a compass, right? The needle of the compass will go to different directions. You have to know where you're going. Where am I going north? Am I going toward the story? And then a compass can be combined with a map. So the sales world has a different topography than, wealth management or interviews. But successful navigators use a compass and a map in combination. So what this is alluding to is a compass to navigate your conversations, but you still have to have expertise, domain expertise about sales and et cetera. And the two combined together will allow you to navigate your conversation effectively.
I love that. Incidentally, Matt Elsom from Emma 3D, he chimed in. Great to see a well thought out framework to apply to the rambling BS at times. I love that, Matt. It's good to see you, by the way.
It's great.
So Brian, I know the book is coming out soon. Do you want to just take a minute and just share
when's
the book going to be available? And I know you're doing a couple book launches.
Supposedly the ebook's supposed to be available and ready to purchase on April 1st. The hardcover or the softcover book on April 14th. We're going to have 2 book launch events, April 9th and April 12th. You certainly will have some information up on my website, raiseyouraq.com. And we're going to have a couple panelists, co-authors. James Kakis will be on one call, Devin Reed on another. So
Great.
Definitely focusing on sales, marketing, and interviews during the book launch.
Super. And you'll get me those links, and I'll share those on my LinkedIn profile as well. Incidentally, we have a question from an unknown LinkedIn user, an unidentified LinkedIn user. Any plans for an audiobook?
Yeah, I'm in discussions with the publisher about doing that. So I'll make sure to share this video with the publisher and say, we need to have an audiobook. And I think it would be a good audiobook, but I'm biased.
Excellent. So Brian, before we wrap up, I always close with 3 sort of lightning round questions. And you may or may not have seen this in some of my other sessions, but May I indulge you for just a few minutes to ask you 3 quick questions?
Please, go for it.
So, I help people obviously in pre-sales, and we give a lot of demos. So one of the questions I like to ask is, have you ever given a demonstration that went particularly poorly? And maybe more in your context, have you ever tried to give maybe a quote demonstration of your framework or an explanation of your framework that just sort of crashed and burned for some reason? And if so, why? Why do you think?
Yeah, early on, I had an opportunity to potentially bring on board some consulting partners in Europe. And this is before the book was even out, and I crashed and burned. I actually was too focused on the how, I think, or actually the analytical, the theory and concepts. I was so interested in helping them understand how the theory worked and how it related to other theories. And I was like an academic presentation, and it was wrong. And a metaphor for that, I know this is a tendency for me, is I've been told people want to know what time it is, and I want to tell them how the watch is made. So I have to be aware, again, my style, I'm analytical. I have to calm myself down. And one thing I've found myself doing is not preparing for sessions, because I would over prepare. I would, do 2-3 pages of notes, and I'm like, totally ready to go. And I found I'm much better if I don't prepare at all. I just, try to be more organic.
I love that. I just so love it. Incidentally, and I don't know I don't recall if you've read my book, but habit 3 is to prepare with both effectiveness and efficiency in mind. One of the things I like to say is to your point, the less we know going into meetings, the more we tend to prepare because we don't know anything. We're like, well, I got it, right? And I finally learned the less we know, the less we prepare, and the less we just go in, and by the way, your compass is the perfect framework, right? Like if I have my compass and I've got answers to any questions, then I go in and figure out, okay, where do they need me to go? And now I'm prepared to go in whatever direction they need me to go in. I love that analogy. I love the way we've tied that together. So fantastic. Question number 2, we're going to reverse it a little bit. And I assume from time to time you are on the receiving end of a demonstration, maybe the receiving end of a software demonstration. Have you ever sat through a demonstration? Do you recall sitting through a demonstration that was particularly effective and particularly compelling and engaging? And if so, what about it was so either memorable or engaging as you recall?
Yeah, I think, doubling down some of your language there, as you said, like, efficiency and quality. So the best demos I've received have the minimal amount of software shown but they show just exactly what I need. And this relates in the AQ framework to my theory about my business or a story I think is important. Just come in there like a laser and show me what I need to get excited about. Don't take me on a grand tour of like every single feature and function in the upper right-hand corner is the drop-down menu. I mean, I don't need to know that right now. So those are the best demos that are just lightning and allow me to take some control and say, here's my need. How's this going to solve it? And then show me as quickly as possible.
I love that. I love that. Particularly the second part, right? Allow me as the customer to take some ownership of the conversation and begin to drive you, right?
Yeah.
And incidentally, I like to call that laser focus. I like to call that the MVD, the minimum viable demo, right?
Nice.
Just show me just what I need to say. And again, this is something I'm going to start talking about. The minimum viable demo may be 6 key points, right?
Yeah.
Theory, story, concept, metaphor, procedure, and action.
Yep.
Oh, that's scary, Brian. I think I just memorized the six components. So just having this conversation is helping.
Got it.
Incidentally, Matt said it's attempting to answer the question they asked, but also the question that they should have asked, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes, and to Matt's point, sometimes as a sales engineer, I may say you're asking this, but out of curiosity, is this also a concern, right? So sometimes we need to help people ask better questions. All right.
Let me say this related to that.
Please.
Complementary answers are powerful. So the company, thinks their theory is X, then you could sort of pivot them. Well, tell me a story about that. And then you realize their strategy and their story don't match up. And as you start to pick away, there's this idea of coherency. The truth is coherent. All 6 answers will triangulate. And if you find a weakness in one, it will be shown someplace else. So that can really help you move the buyer to what they really need to understand, so to speak.
I love that. Well, and the other thought that I have is that if you're triangulating, to use your term, what I like about that is that means you may be dealing with some C-level folks that are primarily interested in the why, right? Mm-hmm. But then you may be dealing with some users who are mostly concerned about the how, right? Yeah. So by triangulating, you're more likely to sort of pick up everybody along the way. So,
I have to add one thing,
please.
Maybe a high minimum viable conversation, MVC or something. I mean, make that up right now. Could be 3 answers. Triangulation, GPS 3 points. If you can cover 3 answer modes, they form a triangle. You probably have the basic foundation for something high quality. But if you're only focusing on 1 answer, not so good. 2 answers, not so good. 3, you're starting to move around the circle a little bit. You're starting to cover multiple questions, maybe from the left and right side. So MVC is 3 answers.
I love that. I love that. See what we just did? We're creating on the fly.
I created that. That was nice.
The minimum viable question, the minimum viable conversation. I love it. So final question for you, Brian, and this is usually the one that people don't see coming, which makes it fun for at least for me. If you could ask me one question, what might it be?
Wow. What do you see wrong with this framework?
Oh, that is a tough question. What do I see wrong with the framework? I'm going to bring the framework up to answer this question.
I promise not to respond to anything you say.
Yeah.
Let your word be the last word.
So I don't know if it's wrong with the framework. I'll answer slightly different question. What do I think might be the challenge in adoption?
Perfect. Love it.
And I think the challenge in adoption is going to be first of all, the obvious applicability. I don't know if it's going to be immediately obvious to everyone how applicable it is to virtually every conversation, number one. And number two, I think moving it from sort of the mental sort of check down to the natural response, right? And really getting it ingrained will be difficult. So, but I think like it's one of those things where I love it. It makes sense. I can imagine people saying it makes sense and I get it. I'm just not sure how to use it, right? Or I'm not sure how to apply it. So I think that'll be the challenge. But hopefully conversations like this, and I know you're doing lots of conversations like this, hopefully conversations like that or like this will mitigate that challenge. And the more you talk, like I said, I mean, I read the one chapter that James and Devin wrote, and I was an instant convert. So I was excited to get more engaged. So in any event, thank you so much, Brian. Any closing words or thoughts from you before we part?
Now, this has been a pleasure, and if anyone's interested, visit raiseyouraq.com. And Chris, hopefully your audience hear more from us. Look forward to the opportunity of collaborating with you going forward on some of this AQ material. Fantastic.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for being my guest. It has been an absolute pleasure. Huge fan of your work, and I can't wait to participate and join at least one of the book launches. So thank you so much. And for those folks who hung around and joined us, thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much, all.
Bye. Thank you.